And for those 2 hours, you can forget about the glamorous heights of Clifton Village. Up at the top of the hill, Clifton Village. Bear that in mind if you're heading up there, uphill climb no matter which way you choose. You live up in Clifton?
No, don't. No. But I can never think it was Clifton.
Clifton, there you go. No. First eye-opening fact of the day. Yeah, it's actually at the top of the hill. I'm liable to go off on tangents. That's why I said approximately 2 hours. Feel free to ask me anything you like, but seeing as you brought up Clifton, yeah, it's at the top of the hill because the wealthy Georgians wanted to live as far away from the smelly harbour. And of course they could have sedan chairs and things to carry them up there. So yeah, they're away. And even more broadly, wealthy areas of cities are often in the west because that's generally the way the trade winds blow. So the smelly air gets blown over to the poor people in the east of the city and they get the fresh stuff. But yeah, up at the top of the hill because of the stench of the harbour. Which is not how you find it today. Our beautiful harbour side. The finest city centre in the land. Forget about the harbour side as well. Leave those cocktails for later this evening. You can also forget about Stoats Croft, the bohemian heart of Bristol, the yin to Clifton's yang. Forget about it for the next 2 hours because you are in the heart of the city. A heart which still beats as strongly now as it did 1,000 years ago. And what we're about to do is head from here through some interesting back streets towards Bristol Bridge. We will then loop back, focusing in on the Corn Exchange to this ferry spot before heading beneath the streets into what was the biggest public air raid shelter during World War II. As I was describing, a complete time warp, beautiful survivor from that time. And we may as well begin at the beginning. The origins of Bristol can be found over in what is now Castle Park, and those origins were Saxon, so we're talking about the 8th, 9th century. The Romans weren't too interested in this plot of land. They had a small settlement in Seamills over on the Avon Gorge, but they were far more concerned with keeping their toes nice and warm in their jacuzzis over in Bath. Very little Roman remains have been found in Bristol itself. So the Saxons moved in. They placed their settlement over there because it was naturally defended by the River Avon to the south and the River Frome to the north. The River Frome still flows under the city centre, under the Broadmead shopping centre, and emerges in the harbour side in front of the Watershed Cinema. And we'll reference the Frome a couple of times as we walk around because it's been relocated, formed part of the city's defences, and has run along different streets. So yeah, the Saxons were over there. By the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, the city had expanded past where we are today, and by the 16th century was roughly at the end of Corn Street. And that's where the 16th century city walls would have stood. And by the time the Georgians arrived in the 18th century, the harbour footprint was as you'll find it this afternoon if you head for one of those cocktails. And by that moment in time, Bristol had risen to become the second wealthiest city in the country after London and the most important trading port. Haven't got anyone from Liverpool with us this morning. You've lived there? Okay, well I don't have to be too careful. But that status of the most important trading port did ebb and flow a bit between Liverpool and Bristol, but Bristol held that ground for many hundreds of years. And by that period in time, by the time the Georgians had arrived, you'd have found 13 banks situated here on Corn Street. You'd have found our own stock exchange and, of course, our beautiful Corn Exchange, regarded as John Wood the Elder's finest civic structure. And basically, I think Bristol Council was starting to get a bit jealous of Bath. Bath had just been re-landscaped by John Wood the Elder, the master architect. He had recreated their version of Palladian Rome that you'll find if you visit Bath today. So they invited John to build an exchange to reflect the city's newfound status. And it's roughly based on the north side of Queen Square in Bath. So it's kind of meant to resemble a palace in its design. And as we walk around, it's worth looking up at many of these buildings, especially at the very top, because you'll see friezes which reference the story of Bristol, the story of the business or bank which occupied the structure originally. And the Corn Exchange is no exception. These carvings reference the three major continents with which the international trade was taking place, those being America, Asia, and Africa. So over on the right, we have a very fine looking Asian elephant, judging by the sides of his ears. A little bit further in, you'll see a Native American with tobacco leaves around his head, representing the tobacco trade, and a very Western looking Native American, I think it's worth pointing out as well. Over to my right, your left, you'll see a fine fellow with a turban and a manicured moustache, representing the Middle East. And over on the far left, a jolly camel. That camel's quite accurate. The one a bit further in is getting a bit toothy and shaggy. You won't see many camels like that walking around the Gobi Desert. And if you're inside the building, keep your eyes open, because there are some creatures which seem to be based on someone's drunken uncle's description of a platypus that he once saw in the middle of the night on a ship. There's a particular platypus with long horse's legs and kind of antennas coming out, etc. Keep your eyes open. Referencing the international trade, as I was describing. However, trading had been taking place in this part of Bristol long before the Corn Exchange arrived in 1743. And the first link to that earlier period can be found in these bronze pillars, that run along the front of the building. These pillars are known as nails, and it's from these nails that we find an English phrase which goes to pay on the nail or cash on the nail. It's quite an unused phrase these days, so don't expect to hear it banded around the streets as you're walking through Bristol, but it basically means you pay when you pick something up. Cash on collection, pay on the nail. But they're very interesting historic monuments, so let's head over and take a closer look. Okay, you might want to squeeze in, won't bite. So here we have one of our nails, and I'll talk about this particular example because it's so well preserved. Almost unbelievable, dating from 1594, and pretty much a 430-year-old object, and still looking so crisp. Its mouldings are so finely preserved. And as you look along the street, the one on the far right is slightly lower. It's a simpler design, and its mouldings have all been rubbed off, so presumably even older than this. And this particular nail is a gift for a tour guide, because all the information is written around the top. And it itself was a gift of Master Robert Kitchin, merchant and sometime mayor and alderman of this city. And these were functional objects. They weren't just decorative. The idea being that merchants would gather round, examples of goods would have been brought up from the harbour side, plopped on the street, and a bit like a gambling table, merchants would place their bids on top, and obviously whoever bid the most got the goods. Another story we'll return to as we're walking around, especially when we're inside the building talking about the roof. Trading was taking place outdoors. This was traditional. It's quite likely that these nails replaced a system of trading on barrels. That system continued in the United States for quite a long time. And it's possible that those barrels replaced a much older system where trading took place at a stone called a mark stone. And some people think it's from mark stone that we get the term market. We'll get to that in a little bit later on. The lip around the edge is also somewhat practical, somewhat decorative, supposedly designed to keep the coins in place, I guess, in case we suffer one of our many earthquakes that we get all the time in Bristol. Don't touch this too much. It's full of very random material. But the lip also references the design of a coin. It kind of looks like a giant coin. And does anyone know why coins have these lips still today around their edge? Stop flipping. Got a shady past revealing itself. If you ever look at very ancient coins, they're kind of a bit like chocolate chip cookies all over the shop with bits sticking off. Very easy to clip a bit off, and by the end of the day you've got enough metal to make another coin. Put a rim around it, and that's very hard to do. They still did it, but just with a file, very subtly. But nonetheless, stop clipping. But the nails were moved here as a bit of a ceremonial gesture when the Corn Exchange was opened. They were actually in use a little bit further down the street. So if we head down, I'll show you where they originally stood. But our nails were originally positioned in this location of Corn Street. You'd have found 6 against the northern wall of All Saints Church and 4 against the wall of the building which preceded the registry office. And these 2 lines of nails were known as the Merchant's Tollsy and the Mayor's Tollsy, or the Tollsy Court. And the trading was taking place there, again outdoors, and local court cases were held here. Now, whilst researching this tour, I had to look up the term Tollsy. I'd never heard it before. I thought maybe every medieval town had a Tollsy court. They did not. They were particular to the southwest. And Bristol's Tollsy Court remained until the 1970s. After the county court must have looked at their books and thought, hang on a minute, why is all this money going to the Tollsy Court? What is this Tollsy Court all about? And turns out it was cheaper to have your case tried there, so the county court was losing out, and they scrapped it.
Wow.
It's 700 years of tradition. I think maybe the last one operating in the country. Anyway, they got rid of it. But yeah, Tollsy, the word, the etymology of the term comes from to pay a toll, toll bridge, toll road, toll house, Tollsy. Yes, the nails at the Tollsy Court operated outdoors. Which we will be returning to often. Not in the 1970s. I doubt it. No, originally. However, it's a relationship between the Mayor's Tollsy and the Merchant's Tollsy that provides our first link to the darkest period in Bristol's past, the darkest stain on the city's history. That, of course, being the transatlantic slave trade. We'll be returning to the transatlantic slave trade, or the triangular trade, as we walk around, but its origins can be found here. Few people are aware that the trading of people was taking place in Bristol long before the 16th century, possibly as far back as the Vikings. Definitely through our Civil War, we had losing sides in battles, being sent over to work in Ireland, and some of the first workers in the plantations in Virginia were English prisoners of war. You could also sell your child as an indentured servant to go and work for 7 years in Ireland. And that trading was taking place here on Corn Street. Judge Jeffreys, of all people, the famous hanging judge, when he came through Bristol looking for rebels to try, put the Mayor of Bristol on trial as a kidnapping knave, because he was so shocked at this trafficking of people out of the city. So yes, that trade predates what's called the triangular trade, the transatlantic slave trade. However, saying that, it's important to distinguish between an indentured servant and an enslaved person. It's very different to either buy your passage and then go and work for 7 years, or your dad selling his son into servitude for 7 years. It's a completely different kettle of fish to actually being enslaved. Its origins can be found here. So, if we head up to where that van is conveniently parked, I'll describe the centre of the medieval Old Town. Okie doke, so we now find ourselves at the heart of the medieval city of Bristol, and crucially at a crossroads: Corn Street, Broad Street, High Street and Wine Street. And we can quite clearly see that crossroads in this, the oldest map of Bristol in existence. Obviously not the original. He'll be fine. Is he pulling in? It's a nightmare distraction. He'll be fine. Yes, obviously not the original, but 1478. And it shows the junction behind us, behind me, and quite clearly our High Cross. Beautiful 14th century bit of medieval architecture. The High Cross was constructed in 1373 to commemorate Bristol's newfound status as a county, which also gave it the legal right to hold a market, interestingly enough. But yeah, that date, if your maths is pretty good, makes this Bristol's 650th anniversary as a city. And the High Cross was standing pretty much right behind me until a jeweller called John Vaughan, who had his shop in this fine tin frame building, complained to the council, thought it was going to fall over, fall on himself or fall on his shop, so they moved it. And now, if you're very interested, you can see this exact same structure in the Stourhead estate in Wiltshire. There you go. You might also recognise it from Berkeley Square, a fine Georgian square at the top of Park Street on the left, where they have a replica. It's only that much of it, but it's still an impressive thing. And if anyone is a super fan or has a very good memory, you might recall a mid-90s costume drama called The House of Elliot, and that was filmed a lot around Berkeley Square and a lot around St Nicholas Market. A friend of mine, Carl, is kind of learning the ropes to be a guide on the tour, and he's very enthusiastic to the point that he's now binge watching The House of Elliot. Now, a Dutch house no longer remains either. Here's a better image. You can locate yourself by the curvature of the top of this building to my right. So this would have been directly opposite the side of the road. And yeah, the Dutch house is arguably one of our greatest architectural losses from World War II. I mentioned that the heart of the Saxon town would be found in what is now Castle Park. That medieval town remained up until the 1940s, and it was densely packed. Bristol suffered 6 major raids during World War II.
Wow.
It was hit as heavily as any other city, and the first raid in the city centre destroyed what was destroyed the heart of the old town in what is now Castle Park. And you would have found Wine Street stretching behind me, packed full of department stores. High Street coming up here to the Dutch House. Mare Laporte Street heading in to the old town in that direction. Dolphin Street heading in from the north. Bridge Street along the waterfront. You'd have had Castle Street, the main shopping street in Bristol, running straight through the middle. You'd have found 5 theatres in what is now Castle Park and 2 hospitals. Now all that remains is St Peter's Church and Mare Laporte Church, both bombed out. And that raid took place on a fateful evening, which we'll return to often throughout this tour, obviously when we get into the air raid shelters. And that night was Sunday, November the 24th. So we lost our Dutch house on that fateful evening. This is the view that would have presented itself on Monday the 25th. Utter devastation. We know this is the Monday afterwards because the army very quickly pulled down what was remaining. They didn't want it standing as a reminder. It was such an iconic building. They didn't want it to kind of lower morale. Here's a shot, an Edwardian image looking down Wine Street directly behind me, showing how different the architecture used to be. It's worth swiveling around for a second actually just to see the amazing Georgian Victorian architecture which survives on Corn Street, and then swivel this way and the post-war reconstruction. It's as if a force field ran up High Street, down Broad Street. Absolutely miraculous escape if you think about it. The Corn Exchange was hit, other buildings were hit this side, but yeah, it was so heavily concentrated in that area. And yeah, the thinking behind targeting that part of the city was that the Luftwaffe wanted to lower morale. They wanted to take out the fun stuff where you go for a good time. Obviously it did not work. And here's a shot of Wine Street the morning after. These are Bristol Auxiliary Fire Service officers, true unsung heroes, wearing the same jacket that I am. But yeah, clearly it did not work. And we've all heard the term Blitz Spirit, I presume. If you were to Google Blitz Spirit, have you heard Blitz Spirit? Is that translated to Malaysia? Take it back with you. It basically means that if things are tough, you kind of pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you just carry on. So you just keep going in the face of adversity. And if you wanted to Google Blitz Spirit, this may as well be the image that comes up. It's not the image, but it may as well be. This photograph, believe it or not, was taken the other side of the road.
Wow.
It's the chef from Jones's department store. Jonesy's was a big department store. Its facade was on Wide Street, but its back end was on Mary Laporte Street. And this is taken on Mary Laporte Street. We know this because the bridge, I'll show you a photograph of Mary Laporte Street before it was hit later in the tour. And that's where our friend the chef is cooking up his hot pots. Now, photographs like this were staged occasionally by the government for propaganda purposes to raise morale. But I've seen this image from different angles. It looks like he's putting a genuine kind of effort together. And also, I don't think this would have been staged because the raid wasn't publicised. All that was talked about in the press was a town in the west was hit last night. They didn't want the nation's morale lowering as well. Bristol wasn't considered a strategic target, and they thought it might kind of spread panic if cities other than ports were being other than strategic ports were being hit. So why would you take a propaganda photograph if you weren't going to publicise it? Nonetheless, sticking with World War II for a moment longer, we still around. I want to swing around because we're always encountering some kind of van. Swing around in front of me here. Swing this way, Gabriel. Yeah, sticking with World War II for a moment longer. Behind me, to my left, your right, you'll see the Grand Hotel. Looking very grand today as well. Incidentally, the Grand Hotel is built in a style of architecture called Bristol Byzantine style, which came over from Venice. You'll see a lot of Venetian-inspired buildings, especially around our harbour side. Essentially, architects looked at Venice, thought they've got a lot of water, we've got a bit, that'll do, we'll nick the architecture. It is basically as simple as that. So you'll see Venetian, especially Venetian warehouses along our waterfront. And if you've been to Venice and seen those huge plateaus on the Grand Canal, they often have this overhang to provide some shade, which the Grand Hotel has also. But the Grand played a fascinating role, not just for Bristol, but for the whole of the nation through World War II. Because the Grand was the check-in for Bristol City Airport. You'd come here to be driven out to Whitchurch to then fly over to Portugal. Portugal was neutral during the conflict, so it was into Portugal that some of our politicians, our diplomats, would fly in, have meetings, international peace talks in Lisbon, and with other allied nations. These weren't for holidaymakers going to get some summer sun on the Algarve. But along with our politicians and diplomats, some of our undercover agents flew into Portugal on these flights. They'd then meet the French resistance, who take them over the Pyrenees and up into mainland Europe on that route. Some were dropped on military flights, but it's well documented that some flew into Lisbon, having left from the Grand Hotel. So it's our #1 spy hotel. You can imagine our real-life James and Janet Bond sitting in the foyer with newspapers and holster in them to their eyes, waiting for their flight, their lifts out to Whitchurch. And it really is our spy hotel, because I've only very recently been informed that Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, flew into Portugal himself during World War II, and whilst there took a trip to Estoril and visited a casino. And it was coming back from that trip that he wrote Casino Royale. But to get there, he also would have had to have left from the Grand Hotel. Wow. The most famous and tragic passenger, however, to have been on one of those flights has to be the actor Leslie Howard, of Gone with the Wind fame. His flight was shot down over the Bay of Biscay and never made it. That was his final journey. And if you look online, there are conspiracy theories suggesting that his flight was targeted. Leslie Howard was a very outspoken critic of the Nazi Party and made propaganda films for the government, so maybe they tracked his flights. So, yes, fascinating past in that one building. We're going to be skipping forward to the 1960s quite often as we walk around Foreign Exchange today, because the building had another amazing period in its past when it was a major music venue. Some of the biggest bands in the world cut their teeth in our Exchange Hall, the biggest of which has to be the Rolling Stones. Yeah, many more. We'll save them for later, but many more. Yeah, the Stones played 4 times in 1964, and each of those times they stayed at the Grand Hotel. And each of those times they were refused entry to their restaurant because their hair was too long. Quite right too. They probably refused to wear the obligatory suit and necktie. Can't see a teenage Mick Jagger, Keith Richards complying by any kind of dress code, any kind of code. But more importantly for Bristol, the Wurzels have stayed at the Grand.
Well, yeah.
And where is their blue plaque like me? But yeah, we'll skip forward to the 60s in a moment's time, and for now, head through All Saints Lane. Okay, you might want to squeeze against the wall by Cameron's barbershop for a second. Okie doke. So we'll just pause here on All Saints Lane for a couple of reasons. Firstly, take a look at this wall. The oldest structure you'll see today, 12th century part of All Saints Church. The whole building dated from the 12th century, but the north side was lost in a fire, and as part of that fire we lost a library, which was the first public library in the land, open to anyone who wished to learn, which translated back then as anyone rich enough to be able to read. But nonetheless, we'll be able to see the top, the cupola of the church later on when we're inside the building, and it's got flames in stone all around the top of the church, referencing the fact that it burnt down. But this bit survives, so it's the oldest structure we'll see today. Also, we'll pause to have a look at this cut through to the facade of the Harbour Hotel, which originally was the West of England and South Wales Bank. Again, a Venetian-inspired building based on St Mark's Library in Venice. Amazing Baroque style of architecture, every available space filled with beards and cherries. And it's so elaborate that when it was complete, it bankrupted the bank. So they barely got chance to open, and then it was swiftly taken over by Lloyd's. But they gifted building Bristol quite a building, and yeah, again, those carvings, they tell the story of the mercantile past of Bristol and the bank itself. So actually quite useful to see it in sections. It's almost overwhelming when you see the whole thing. But you've got kind of cherub merchant trading at the top there. So in the centre you have a European cherub merchant with a bag of gold and a kind of dressing gown on, and he's doing a deal for what looks like some ivory from Middle Eastern cherub, then a Native American cherub with tobacco leaves around his head again, and then you've got bows of ships above every other window, and yeah, telling a visual story of Bristol's mercantile past. And yeah, it's views such as this which have attracted film directors, TV producers to St Nicholas Market to film various period dramas. As I mentioned, we had David Tennant and Jilly Cooper series being filmed last week. Towards the beginning of the year, we had Sherlock Doctor Who with the TARDIS appearing around St Nick's. If you've been keeping up to date with Bristol Post website at that time, you'd seen the TARDIS all over the shop around here. We have had Sherlock walking down these streets, and also over Christmas the BBC were down here with a beautiful looking period drama. I think it's coming out next Christmas, with guys in their stovepipe hats and like street urchins in rags creeping around, and take away these signs and you have a ready-made film set. Absolutely magical. We'll also pause here on All Saints Lane for a much more serious reason, because this is a very appropriate moment to return to that darkest stain on the city's history, the transatlantic slave trade, or as some people refer to it, the triangular trade. And by that we mean goods leaving England for Africa. Those goods would then be exchanged for spices and slaves, who would then be taken over to the Americas in exchange for sugar, rum, tobacco, later cotton, which would come back to Bristol. And it was especially the sugar which made this city rich, white gold. Bristol was known as Sugarloaf City at the time. And it really was a cynical process. The most common cargoes to be taken over to Africa to be exchanged for the enslaved people were ships full of guns and ships full of gin. why were we sending guns and gin over to the African west coast? Well, it was that area which had a lot of inter-tribal warfares, and it was the losing sides from those wars which we were buying then as enslaved people. And what's the best way of keeping a war going? Flood the area with guns and gin. Horrendously cynical. And it's worth bearing in mind that almost every structure you can see at the moment is built on those ill-gotten gains. But I don't just want to describe the triangular trade in this point on All Saints Lane. I think this could be described as the epicenter for Bristol's involvement, this actual spot in the street. And why do I say that? Well, originally we would have been surrounded by the 13 banks, the stock exchange, dealing with those ill-gotten gains. You're leaning against the wall of the Corn Exchange, which managed the whole activity, and we're opposite All Saints Church, which, as I said, on the northern side had the beginnings of buying and selling people in Bristol. More than that, who do we have buried inside the church? We have Edward Colston and the Colston family too. And most of us will remember Colston being toppled from his plinth in June 2020 on the back of Black Lives Matter. If you want to go and see Colston's empty plinth, it's in Broad Quay, now a kind of nondescript square in the city centre, but that was originally the broadest part of the harbour, and there's a big crack in the pavement where his statue hit the floor. And either it was very well planned, or there were some quick thinking protesters, because his statue was dragged so far to meet the water, but they didn't chuck him straight in. They took him a bit further to Piro's Bridge, which is a bridge referencing an enslaved African who lived in Bristol. So there was a bit of foresight in chucking him there. Nonetheless, I think for that reason, if you were to draw all those lines on a map, they might cross here on All Saints Lane. Bristol itself, however, can also claim to be the epicenter of the abolition movement, which finally led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. It was actually Thomas Clarkson who trod the streets of Bristol and Liverpool, not William Wilberforce. Most people have heard of Wilberforce, but it was Clarkson who visited these cities, interviewed the local sailors, recorded how poor the conditions were on these slaving vessels, and it was those sailors' first-hand accounts which were then given to Wilberforce, and he then presented them to Parliament, which then brought about this slavery bill in 1807. But that just outlawed the slave trade. It wasn't until 1833 that slavery itself was outlawed. However, if you pick apart that story a little bit, it turns out that these sailors weren't actually describing how bad the conditions were on the ships for the enslaved people. They were describing how bad the conditions were for themselves. The public outrage was that so many of our sailors weren't returning from these voyages. At some point, 40% of the crew weren't coming back. And it was this that motivated Parliament to act. It wasn't actually the plight of the Africans. Nonetheless, the net result is that it brought about the end of the slave trade. And if you're particularly interested, after the tour, cross Bristol Bridge. On the right-hand side, you'll find the Seven Stars pub, and it was in the back room of that pub off Victoria Street, which Clarkson interviewed those sailors in. So you can extend the tour quite well about it. But we'll now head to the Glass Arcade. Stone-covered market. I think they kind of had to make this stone to hold up the roof, basically. And it was a fruit and veg and flower market up until about 1980. And now, as you see, it's one of the most vibrant parts of the city centre. Good morning, Stephen. It's on the back of that one man this whole place operates. Wow. I mentioned Margaret, our friendly ghost, at the beginning of the tour. Stephen will not enter the basement alone, even though he is the head honcho, for fear of Margaret. And don't get a shock when you go down this afternoon. I've put Reg, our resident air raid warden. He's a mannequin in a uniform and a hat, but I didn't tell Stephen about Reg, and let him find him for himself, and you'll see why I gave him a short later on. Nonetheless, yes, one of the most kiosks there, which, if you think about it, is an even more terrifying prospect. As if being in an air raid wasn't bad enough, You've got to then run under a 150-metre glass roof to get to the entrance. But yeah, that's where we'll be when I point out the entrance and the exit. We're also in front of the Rummer Hotel. The Rummer was the staging point for the stagecoaches before Bristol Temple Meads arrived, before the Great Western linked Bristol with London. This is where you would have alighted from your carriage, having travelled from Bath or even further. And it's still very atmospheric to imagine those old horses and carriages rattling in under that archway and weary passengers tumbling out for a hot toddy in the Rummer Hotel. Skipping forward to the 1960s again, there are obviously a lot of anecdotes which survive from these teenage bands that went on to be globally famous and hanging around St Nicholas Market about the time. And one anecdote in particular involves Roger Daltrey from The Who at the Rummer Hotel. It is said that Daltrey was thrown out of the Rummer having started a scrap with the bouncer. Roger Daltrey evidently fancied himself as a bit of a bruiser, ended up getting in a fight everywhere they went, much to Pete Townshend's annoyance, and they were thrown out of the Rummer after the bouncer didn't like the way Roger was looking at his girlfriend. What's nice about the 1960s is that this is living memory, and at this point in the tour a couple of weeks ago, a guy piped up and said, I don't think he'd have been thrown out of the Rummer Hotel. They had a speakeasy in the basement called the Smuggler's Bar, so it's much more likely that's where you would have found the Who post-gig. And feel free then, therefore, to picture teenage Roger Daltrey being pulled up these steps by the scruff of his neck by security with a grumpy Pete Townsend following up behind.
I'm getting bored of this, Roger. Everywhere we go.
He's always grumpy, one of the Pete Townsend. But that's where it probably happened. Trying to rein in the tangents, but I've got to throw this one in as well. Another lady came up with an anecdote even more recently. She was called Christine. We actually interviewed her after the tour, and Christine was saying that she might have been at that gig. She was at a Who gig in the 60s, and Christine and her friends, who were all 15 years old, saw the Who unpacking their van at the front of the Corn Exchange. They didn't have any roadies, they were unpacking their own van. They were all a bit starstruck and were then promptly chatted up by Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend. We won't say anything more about that, 15-year-olds. And then they were taken for a pint at the Crown for a couple of drinks before the gig. So there's a day in the life of the Who. A few pints with a group of 15-year-olds and then thrown out of the Rummer Hotel. Anyway, different time. But we'll head down in this direction. Okay, so we're now at the south side of the market, and behind you, in front of me, are some steps leading down to Baldwin Street. And I mentioned right at the beginning of the tour that the 16th century city wall ran along the line of Baldwin Street. And so these steps behind you are kind of tracing that incline of what was the defensive city wall. And the River Frome, I also mentioned at the beginning of the tour. I've never been in the picture, so I don't know why that is. Yeah, this is a 3-month course, by the way, with an exam at the end there. Anyway, yes, the River Frome was diverted along Baldwin Street at that point, also being a somewhat defensive mode stroke open sewer for the city. And I've got another beautiful illustration here to show you, looking up All Saints Lane that we've just walked down. Showing the view as it would have been before the glass roof was installed. You'll notice the stone covered market has yet to be built as well, the wooden covered market. And it's nice to see the south side of the Corn Exchange as it was originally intended to be seen without the glass roof. But essentially not much has changed in all that time. Even the Crown Inn is still in place, proving that if you want your business to last in Bristol, make sure you're serving booze. Now, up until quite recently, we were rounding the corner of St Nicholas Church. It's now a building site, so we're not doing that. And also, I'm in the process of trying to thin out as much as possible from this talk because it's too much trouble there. But if we did round that corner, you're on Bristol Bridge. And I liked going that way because there is a fascinating, creepy urban legend attached to Bristol Bridge and that fateful evening I was describing earlier and will return to later, the 24th of November 1940, the night that the old town was destroyed.
Wow.
It is said, the night of that air raid, that a river of rats was seen crossing Bristol Bridge. A river of rats fleeing the old town. This is quite well documented, especially by the brewery workers who were in the breweries on Welshback. And again, I have had 2 people on the tour so far who have said, yeah, my grandmother used to talk about this, oh, my auntie used to talk about this. A river of rats.
Wow.
Now, if like me, when you first hear this story, you're probably imagining the old town ablaze, bombs dropping left, right and centre, the rats fleeing the city like a sinking ship. And you'd be forgiven for picturing that scene because that makes sense, but you would be wrong, because the story tells of the rats leaving the city before a single bomb dropped.
That's what they knew.
They knew. Rat-dar. That's what people say. There were 186 German bombers making a beeline for that point in town, so maybe they sensed the vibrations building,
Probably.
freaked out. I don't know why they didn't go down Baldwin Street. They took a left across the bridge. There's no detail of a young fellow with a penny whistle leading them across. But that's what they say, a river of rats before the bombs dropped. So yes, hold that in your mind.
That's
but I
crazy.
can't not tell that story, so I'm trying to still incorporate it without being on the bridge. Also, while we're here, I'm also an artist in my other life, and you'll see a Ukrainian tribute sculpture at the end of the street. That's actually been made from recycled scaffolding foam, but unfortunately, because it was put up at the start of the Russian invasion, it's unfortunately now over a year old, and it's getting a bit weathered. So I'm in the process of covering it in fabric. I don't know if anyone knows the artist Christo, who wraps buildings in fabric and things like that. I'm doing a bit of a Christo on it. But that's one of my sculptures. Just a brief blow of my trumpet there for a second. It's a guerrilla artwork. There's a long story behind how they've arrived, but I think quite reflective of Bristol Council's attitude to creativity. No other city in the world that you can put a huge sculpture up in the city centre and it be somewhat embraced. Okay, no, top on the pavement again for a second. So we're still obviously on St Nicholas Street, and you can see that curvature of the city walls continuing down the street. If you look at the street map of this area, it's very clear the line of where the old city wall used to be. But we'll pause here to have a look at a few more carvings. Firstly, this lovely elephant sticking out the wall of the boardroom bar. He or she is nothing to do with Asia or Africa. It's on the wall because originally this was the elephant pub. And the elephant famously had what was known as a market's license, meaning that it could start serving booze from 6 a.m.
Wow.
for the traders who've been setting up all night, come in for an early morning pint after their shift. I've also heard anecdotes of people leaving the Granary nightclub on Queen Square. A couple of nods of is it Old Horn, is it? Yeah, there you go. Did you ever come to the Elephant afterwards for a swift one? You did? Oh, before? Well, evidently people used to come up. And incidentally, it was in the basement bar of the Granary. The Granary is the beautiful, again, Venetian-inspired Victorian building on the corner of Queen Square. In their basement bar is where that famous scene in Only Fools and Horses where Del Boy leans on the bar and falls through. That was filmed in the... And that bar's opening up very soon. It's going to be a tapas restaurant.
Yeah.
So yes, that's why the elephant's up there. We'll also look at some carvings on this building, another Venetian-inspired building. And the carvings we'll look at are at street level, these 4 figures. Some say represent the 4 seasons, with St Nicholas being winter at the end, kind of makes sense. But the figure that everyone likes to point out and talk about is our mysterious veiled lady. She doesn't really say autumn to me, so that kind of throws out the season. Some say she is a veiled Virgin Mary, possible. Others that she is a rare female depiction of death, which again is possible. I've mentioned Margaret a couple of times, and we're about to go and see her in the basement, and maybe this is Margaret manifesting herself in stone, taking a peek up on the street, seeing what's going on. Who knows? It's a fantastic sculpture though, isn't it? It's very kind of effective and very creepy. But yes, speaking of Margaret, let's go and see how we get on. Oh, there's another carving on the wall there, a lovely water fountain, which was stuck there for Queen Victoria's 40th birthday. Well, as I was saying, these guys, we're just scratching the surface, really. Okay, huddle in here for a second. Yes, this doorway, by the way, has an empty sign up there, which I would like to say is Bristol Blitz experience. That leads down into the basement. That could be their dedicated entrance. It would be a big job, which is again why TripAdvisor reviews would be very, very useful. Seriously, in terms of funding applications, they are. But Heritage Lottery, Historic England coming down soon. Why not? Let's open that up. Get a museum going. Okie doke, here we go. Perfect timing, Leah. Take a look. Highlight of the tour. Bristol Council bin stores. Instagrammable moment. No, I'm serious. Yes, these bin stores. They're worth pointing out because these archways were originally the stables for the post office. The post office originally stood at the end of the street where Trailfinders Travel Agents is today. And it is just coincidence they were coming in. I always like to point these out because I think they give a little hint towards the level of activity that would have been taking place in these streets. Obviously the horses would have been coming in and out, along with the stable hands, the farriers, the blacksmiths. The Corn Exchange itself would have been bustling with the merchants, the city valuers, the insurers. We had 4 newspapers in the surrounding streets with all their associated staff. You would have found the butchers, the bakers, the innkeepers, the hotel owners. These streets would have been even more bustling than they are today. And I think these 2 little stables, for me, they kind of bring all that to life. Next door to the stable doors, you'll see the SN2 on the wall. A nice bronze SN2. That's a parish boundary marker. You'll also see one carved above this doorway. The Georgian market was plonked on top of the medieval Old Town, and the parishes had to be legally marked out. And if you're very eagle-eyed as you're walking throughout the Corn Exchange inside the building, you'll still see the parishes being marked out in corridors. And you'll see SN for St Nicholas, SL for St Leonard's, and SW for St Werburgh's. And those of you familiar with Bristol will be thinking, hang on a minute, we're nowhere near St Werburgh's. Today, the parish and the church of St Werburgh's can be found in the northeast of Bristol. But up until 1877, it would have been here. The parish and the church have been moved. So if we head to the end of the street, I will tell you why. Firstly, there's the post office sign, still carved before travel agent, proving that I wasn't making it up. So, also I wasn't making this up. Up until 1877, you were looking down Corn Street behind me. The view would have been quite different. This is the view that would have presented itself. This street is Small Street, and there's a Small Street right there. And where the Lloyd's Bank building is now situated, you would have found St Werburgh's Church. And if you're really familiar with your Bristol churches, you might recognise this very same church as being the one in today in St Werburgh's on Minor Road by the Miners Arms pub. So what happened was, the Victorians, I think this whole story in a way is one of these many examples of Victorian scale of ambition. The type of thing you can do with an empire on which the sun never sets, you know, the cheap labour and materials that come along with it. You can never imagine a government or town council today even dreaming of doing something like this. But the Victorians, with all their wealth, must have had a conversation that went something along the lines of, you know, that's at Werburgh's Church on Corn Street. It's quite nice, isn't it? But it's in the way a bit. You ever try to get your carriage around Small Street? It's a real kick. But I like it. What are we going to do? Should we knock it down? I like it too much. Can we move it? Can you move a church? Yeah, why not? Let's move it. Let's move the church. We're Victorians. We can do anything. So they did. They moved this church. They took it apart stone by stone, put it on carts and rebuilt it in North Bristol. And if you think about the logistics of doing that, it's almost an impossible task, because the first stones you take apart are the last ones you then put back together. So you need a seriously organised system. And they're meant to have been put back together to within 5 millimetres of their original location, every single stone. And yes, it's now up on minor roads as the Bristol Climbing Centre.
Wow.
Nonetheless, yeah, replaced by the Lloyd's Bank building. Another example of Victorian scale of ambition can be seen in these iron curbs which run along many of our streets in the city centre. Have you noticed these before? These are also Victorian. Their purpose is to stop cartwheels wearing away the edge of pavements. Carts would have been driven into the curbs to slow the vehicle down.
Wow.
That would chip away at the curbstone and replacing. So again, the Victorians thought nothing of lining every street in the land with iron. Why not? We're Victorians. And we can do anything. They pretty much could. They just built the Great Western, the Suspension Bridge, the Essex Great Bridge. We can line the street. Anyway, ironwork such as this used to be found throughout the land up until 1939, the first year of World War II, when ironwork such as this, railings around parks, park benches, were cut down, taken away to supposedly go towards the war effort, to be melted down, to be turned into weapons. However, this was a form of government propaganda, because the government were well aware that most of this metalwork was too low grade and used as weaponry, but they thought they'd do it anyway, to kind of create a sense of urgency, get people seeing a physical change in their local environment. The first year of the war was called the Phony War. Not much had happened. No bombs had dropped. So the government did this to get people taking it a bit more seriously, rolling up their sleeves and digging for victory. But in Bristol, either we saw straight through it, couldn't be bothered, never got round to it, for whatever the reason, they remain. And they're rather smart when they're on your radar. Bring a lot of character to the street. But be warned, if you're parking a new car with its jazzy alloy wheels, they will tear them to shreds. But yeah, most of this iron was actually used as ballast in ships, for which they could have used sand. Some of the railings I've had up recently were used as stretchers.
Wow.
Anyway, let's go and see how Margaret's getting on.